Red Sea. So there's a couple of different possibilities as to which body of water that was, but there's many Salt Lake bodies that makes its way to the Gulf of Aqaba, which is south of there, that has a lot of reeds. Okay, so the Sea of Reeds. We also saw how God leads the people of Israel. So by day, by the cloud, so that's a water-based substance, right? So by the fire, we see quite a bit in the Bible, and that certainly will become part of the sign of the river. That's water, right? So what appears. So when Jesus at Pentecost, the Holy Spirit comes upon the Virgin Mary and the apostles in the form of tongues of fire. So there's a lot of interesting symbolism about the manifestation of God to the Israelites through water and fire. And also that you see that they were saved from destruction from Pharaoh, because Pharaoh could have killed them all. But they were saved from destruction by passing through water. So the Sea of Reeds, they pass through, and the water becomes as of walls. And then then they're able to have enough space, and because the pillar of fire is behind them, that prevents the Egyptians from getting them. And as they cross over into dry land on the other side, then we see that the final act of judgment, which is a severe act of God, the waters crash down upon the Egyptian chariots and their armaments. And so they all drown to death. Yeah. So water, again, just as a quick, has two symbolisms here we see quite a bit in the Bible. And this is also picked up by the Apostle Paul and some of the other writings. We live on the coastline and here in Florida, and I gather if I heard coming right at Vero Beach, we'll soon find out that water won't be so pretty any longer. It'll become an instrument of death for us. So it can become it's a very dangerous thing. Also with Noah and the ark. His family were also saved through the water by the boat, right, the ark. And so the Israelites also are saved through water. So water is what gives us life. We need water for hydration. And that's why John Baptist and certainly Jesus will use water as the very entrance into the life of God. God gives us life, and that life is symbolized right through the water. So that's a baptism. So we have both the symbolism of death and life. St. Paul will say in his letter to the Romans that when you come forth from the waters of baptism, you rise to life and resurrection of Jesus Christ. To really, really remember it. And then we notice that as the Israelites leave, there's this beautiful canticle, this song sung by Miriam, who's the sister of Moses and Aaron. So that's that beautiful canticle that we read last week in chapter 15. And then they left off where they found water. Of course, they're thirsty, right? They're going through dry regions. It's not like Vero Beach. They're going through very rocky places, and so they're thirsty. They couldn't. Bitter. That's the word mara. But how does the waters become sweetened, which means that it's drinkable, that a tree is planted in there. So the early church fathers saw this as a sign of the cross. That it is by the cross of Christ that makes the waters of baptism filled with the Spirit, and that gives us life. So the direct connection of the tree, right, with the cross and the waters, that without Christ with Christ, with the Spirit become sweet. And notice also ordinance, and there he tested them, saying, if you will diligently listen to the voice of your God, and do that which is right in his eyes, and give heed to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases upon you which I put upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord, your healer. So this is kind of a statement of blessing when they are doing the right thing. So when they keep God's commands and they do what the Lord asks of them, they will be blessed. And in this situation, it's very specific, that they will avoid the plagues that came upon the Egyptians that they just witnessed, which was horrible. Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water. Wherever there's water in the desert, a lot of times you'll have big date palms, large date palms that grow. They're either planted there or grow wild. So this is another very important account in the Bible that we really need to take to heart. Manna from heaven. Verse 1, they set out from Elim, and all the congregation, the 15th day of the second month, after they had departed from the land of Egypt. Okay, so this means that they left that watered area with all the date palms, Elim, right? And it says there they come to the wilderness or the desert of sin. So who knew that they made their way to Las Vegas back then? Actually, it doesn't really mean like sin as I committed a sin. It's just the name of the area. Maybe it's a shortening of the Sinai, but it's a day of the second month. So notice that the Passover occurred exactly a month before this. So as we get into chapter 16 at this very moment, that means that they've been on foot for exactly 1 month. After they had departed from the land of Egypt, the congregation of, notice the word murmured. Okay, murmured means complain. So they're complaining. Now, on a natural level, we could probably understand why, right? I mean, if you and I were on foot and we were in desert areas going up and down mountains, not on nice cement sidewalks in Florida, and it's like after a month you're starting to think, where are we going here? What's the end result going to be here? So you can see on a natural level the complaining, but there's a sinful element with that, because when they're complaining, that means that they're losing their faith in God. They're losing their trust in the plan that God has and that Moses is called to really lead them towards. So they really got to walk by faith. They got to walk by faith, and as we are from time to time. And they said to them, would that we have died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. So there's a statement there. Now stop and think about that for a second. Now that's a really rude and ridiculous and obnoxious statement. I mean, they were just in bitter slavery. We had our flesh pots, meaning we were able to eat meat. We had nice pots of stew, right? Flesh pots. Nice stew, your pot roast or something. And it was there that it would have been better if we would have died by the hands of the Egyptians. So, would that we have died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness, to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. Crying out, God is saying that I have a provision in store for them, and they need to keep my law. And the law is going to be this. When they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. So what's the difference on the sixth day? They're to collect what? Twice as much. So this is getting Israel set up for what's going to be codified soon in the Ten Commandments, which is to honor and keep holy the Sabbath day. So just wait, I'm finishing up my new letter to the parish on our religious education program, and also what's expected of our parents sending their kids to our Catholic school here at St. Helens. So I make a very strong emphasis on this commandment. Yeah, it wasn't based on whether they happened to like Moses or Aaron, or think that the music was good in the camp, was entertaining enough. It's because God commanded it. Law, right? My law. So they are to gather. So part of the law here is they're to gather daily, their bread. That's where we get the words from Jesus in the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. So this becomes a common phrase for the Hebrew people all the way from this moment. That on the second part of the law is that on the sixth day they're to collect twice as much. Okay. So it says, verse 6, so Moses and Aaron said to all the sons of Israel, at evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your murmurings against the Lord. For what are we that you murmur against us? And Moses said, when the Lord gives you in the evening flesh to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your murmurings, which you murmur against him, what are we? Your murmurings are not against us, but against the Lord. So Moses is making the point here in Egypt, because they weren't starving. So they're kind of making an accusation that he's brought them out. But the reality is that you're making this accusation against the Lord. So that's a strong statement. Verse 9, and Moses said to Aaron, say to the whole congregation of the sons of Israel, come near before the Lord, for he has heard your murmuring. Wilderness. And behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. There's still this cloud, right, by day. So when we hear the word glory in Hebrew, that's the word Shekinah. So it is this very powerful manifestation of God. It's shocking. Shocking. Murmurings, and the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the murmurings of the sons of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat flesh, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So we might be wondering, well, what's this flesh going to be? Well, the next verse tells us. In the evening, quails came up and covered the camp. Yeah, got the quails and killed them. And in the morning, dew lay around about the camp. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine, flake-like thing, fine as hoarfrost on the ground. When the sons of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? Now by the words, what is it in Hebrew is manhu. That's what it, so in Hebrew, what is it is manhu, and God's given manna. See the play on the words? So there's a play on words, so in their language, they would have immediately connected the dots. For us, we have to go back and take a look at what they were saying. For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is you shall take an omer apiece. So that's about a quart. According to the number of the persons which each of you has in his tent. And the sons of Israel did so. They gathered some more and some less. Actually, it's about 2 quarts. I can't get into that's another subject. Number of the persons which. And the sons of Israel did so. They gathered some more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, I wish it worked that way with toilet paper a few weeks ago. And he that gathered little had no lack. Each gathered according to what he could eat. And Moses said to them, let no man eat any of it. So isn't that interesting? And Moses was angry with them. This is really an interesting substance that God has sent from heaven. It's this manna or bread that came down from heaven. So notice that the quail, so there is birds of quail all the way down to the raven, and that they were to take according to what belonged to them. So when we think about hoarding, like what we just witnessed with toilet paper and paper towels, and then later became C2 hoard. Nothing new. They were doing the same exact things. In the end, everybody had enough for what they needed. Even if they didn't take enough, they had enough. And if they took too much, there was people having now stockpiles of toilet paper that'll last them until the second coming. I'm sure it's nobody here. So it's the same thing with these people. They were stuck, became angry with them. Why? Because they were being selfish. They were not listening to him. They weren't obeying what his instructions were. Verse 22. On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much bread. So remember, on the sixth day, that's when they have to gather twice as much. It's the only day. 2 omers apiece. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to the Sabbath to the Lord, bake what you will bake, and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay by to be kept till the morning. So this is the one day where they collect twice as much, and that they are ready for not doing unnecessary labor, right? So to avoid unnecessary labor. And why does God make that command to avoid unnecessary labor? First of all, we need a day of rest, don't we? So it says, and when God created the heavens and this world, that you and I need to get our R&R and to have a day off or get a day of rest and relax. But it also frees up that day or portion of that day to give our portion back to God, so that we go to Mass and temple on Mount Sinai. So when you're not doing all that unnecessary labor, that frees you up, doesn't it? Verse 23, he said to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Be kept till the morning. Moses said, "It is a Sabbath, there will be none." On the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather. So every time he says something, they got to do something else, right? But yet they found none. So they found none on the seventh day. And the Lord said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? So God notices this bad behavior. That they try to collect too much, or they try to keep it overnight. They're trying to hoard, or they're not doing the thing on the sixth day, getting prepared, and they're still going on the seventh day. He's giving you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you birthday. So the people rested on the seventh day. That's why to this day, if you are to observe very strict Orthodox or Hasidic Jews, sometimes they'll even put a wire. They'll put a wire around their neighborhood. Go and worship and then be at home. But the idea is to never leave where the wire is. Okay? Because that's the symbol of. Verse 31. Now the house of Israel called its name manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. A wafer made with honey. And Moses said, this is what the Lord has commanded. Brought you out of the land of Egypt. That's the third part of the law that God gives. So remember, the first part was that each day they are to go out and collect bread, enough for each day for one person. Secondly, on the sixth day, to collect twice as amount of bread and to prepare it so that it's ready for the Sabbath. Now, an omer of it, a quart, a jar of it, for them as they came out of the land of Egypt. So what we discover is that the Ark of the Covenant, can't get into all the details quite yet, but we'll get to those soon, was the manifestation of the presence of the Lord. One of those objects was that golden jar that contained the manna, the bread from heaven. Pretty cool, huh? Right. Law of God's command. So, verse 33, and Moses said to Aaron, take a jar. Israel ate the manna 40 years till they came to a habitable land. They ate the manna till they came to the border of the land of Canaan. An omer is the 10th part of an ephah. So like 2 quarts for us. So notice here that the bread gives them daily sustenance every day for how long? 40 years. It's going to be 40 years. They don't know quite yet. It's kind of wandering in the desert because of their disobedience to God. What should have been maybe a couple month-long trip, it turns out to be 40 years. They're kind of running around in circles until their time of penance comes to an end, and they make it to of Canaan. By the way, when I do the trip to the Holy Land, which has been postponed to May because of the virus, one of the places that we go on the Jordan extension, the first place we go on the Jordan extension, is that place where Moses saw for the first time Manasseh. Against the mountains, there's still that desert region. That's the city of Jericho to the right. And then as you look up those mountains, you're looking at what is to be Bethlehem and way up in the distance, Jerusalem. From one spot. It is a beautiful, it's one of the most spectacular views ever. So this is God providing his daily bread provisions until they reach the land of Canaan. And then once they reach the land of Canaan, then they're going to feed off of the promised land. Now, just before we continue any further, Jesus in John's Gospel, in the 6th chapter, makes reference to these major events. So, in the very beginning of John chapter 6, this is the next day later, which we're getting into John chapter 6, and they're following him again because they're pretty excited about this idea of getting fed again. And this is quite a spectacular miracle. So Jesus stops them, and he says, "You're coming after me because I did something pretty fantastic for you yesterday." And then he directly states this story. But I am the living bread, or manna. I am the mysterious substance from where? Heaven. So think of the language Jesus uses. So it's bread from heaven. I am the bread from heaven. And the bread, then he goes on later on in the chapter, he starts revealing what the manna is. It becomes even more shocking to hear. He says, so now he's connecting this whole experience. Remember, the Passover just happened a month before this. When God tells them to take the lamb, there has to be a male lamb, to do what with its flesh? The synagogue in the city of Capernaum. That synagogue still exists to this day. Yeah, I mean, the ruins of it. Jesus says, the bread that I will give is my flesh for the life of the world. What did God just feed them with this whole manna incident? The flesh that finds its fulfillment in him. That he is the bread of life, the manna that's come down from heaven, and that he will feed us. He says, for my flesh is true food, and my blood, even though he died, I will raise up on the last day. So he's talking about the power of the resurrection. Now he's revealing himself as Lord of life and death, who has the power of resurrection, which many of the Jews believed it. Some didn't, but many of them did. The Pharisees did. So now Jesus is making a very powerful statement so that when you and I go back to reading and studying in the future, in our time together, the Gospel of John, God has operated redeeming them from Egypt, and how he's going to redeem us for eternity, to bring us to the promised land, not of Canaan, but of paradise, like heaven. How does he give us his flesh as the living bread from heaven? We see that at the Lord's Supper, by taking the elements of Melchizedek. The priesthood of Melchizedek is according to the order of Melchizedek. So this all gets connected by Jesus in a very surprising way, in a very amazing way. And that's the very bedrock of our Catholic faith and why we worship and have the Mass and have priesthood, so on and so forth. So here is the beginnings of this, the beginnings of how God begins to bring that plan of salvation to the world through the people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So once again, all the congregation of the sons of Israel encamped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So again, where they're at. So this whole desert Sinai area, Arabia, and even when you go to Israel or certainly to Jordan, you'll see on the way down to a place like Petra, which isn't too terribly far away from these places. Petra, ancient city. Yeah, it's spectacular. It's these big mountains. It's beautiful, but it's dry. And part of what makes a place like Petra very special is that they mastered scientifically a technique 2,000 to 3,000 years ago to bring water several miles away through fired ceramic pipes all the way into their ancient city in the mountains. But you can see how they get thirsty, right? They get thirsty and they get in trouble. So verse 2, therefore the people found fault with Moses and said, give us water to drink. And Moses said to them, why do you find fault with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? But the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses and said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? So this is the second time we hear this, right? So Moses cried to the Lord, what shall I do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me. So he's getting a little bit desperate. So you can imagine the enormity of his stress. We're talking about myriads of thousands of people that he's leading out of Egypt. You know, and it's hard enough to lead a group of 30 or 40 or 50 people if they get rowdy and obnoxious. He's in his 80s. And he's got all these myriads of thousands of people, and they're all starting to get mad at him because they're thirsty. And they're saying, you brought us out here to kill us. So he doesn't get stoned to death. Verse 5, and the Lord said to Moses, pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the rod with which you struck the Nile, and go. And water shall, this is the area where the Midianites are, where he met Jethro, who was his father-in-law. So Jethro's going to come up in the picture here pretty soon as well. Remember, Jethro was a priest, and he had 7 daughters. You ever come across that, where some families have like 7 sons or 7 daughters? So Jethro had 7 daughters, and Horeb is also where Mount Sinai is. So probably there's this conversation going on with God. So behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb. So it's a specific place, a rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, that the people may drink. By the way, that's the picture I put up on a particular moment. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders. Yes, I'm just throwing this as an interpretation, but any strategic guess? So if there's thousands, keep going backwards and thinking Moses is trying to kill us, he's trying to kill us, you know, we're starving to death, or we're thirsting to death. So these elders represent these individual groups. That's why they're with Moses. Sense. So there's some sort of a strategy on the basic picture. Somebody had to go tell these people. And he called, and Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah. Proof that they weren't being starved or thirsted to death. So remember, they murmured. So these aren't really flattering names for this place. It's their names that define the hardness of their hearts in this moment. In his leadership, they were attacking him, so they weren't respecting him. So it says here, because of the fault finding of the sons of Israel, and because they put the Lord to the test by learned here, just to stop for a second with this event, with the water from the rock. So number 1, again, God hears them. So if they offer a prayer, and they offer prayer through their leadership, through Moses, God hears and God provides. And so in this case, God's providing with the instrument of Aaron's rod, which is going to be the second element found in the box of the Ark of the Covenant. Because it's the symbol of the power of God and also the priesthood that will pouring forth, once he strikes it, will be this fountain, this big flow of water. By the way, St. Paul, we'll see in this incident in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, if you read verses 1 through 6, St. Paul sees this as also pointing to Christ, because water gives us life. They were thirsting, so St. Paul says that the water was Christ. What he's saying is that the water is basically of his grace, that we receive from both poured forth from the heart of Jesus, from his body on the cross, blood and water, which is, by the way, very interestingly encapsulated in the vision of Sister Faustina in the Divine Mercy appearance of Jesus. It's very interesting that from from this heart flowed the blood and the water. We actually have this image right here on the stand. So St. Paul sees in this incident of the rock that was struck, the water flowing, that this is a sign to look at is the same thing Jesus encounters with his own brothers and sisters amongst the Israelites. Remember, they're always asking from him a sign. You're always asking me for a sign, like a song and a dance. They're waiting for him to say the right incantation or the right movement of his fingers so that he creates another miracle. That's why the people were following him the day before with the feeding of the 5,000. They're looking for another one because that one wasn't enough. That wasn't enough, so they're looking for another one. So there's a lesson to be learned here. I remember listening to a guy named Trent Horn from Catholic Answers. I have the tapes in my library here somewhere. And he's debating with an atheist. So a guy that does not believe whatsoever in the supernatural, doesn't believe in God. And so he asks the guy, what would it take for you to believe in God? Through an arm. So what's the atheist looking for here? Or that we see in the Gospels? It's even if God provided that miracle, it wouldn't be enough. They'd be sitting there saying, well, something could have, on the scientific reason, and you're just saying it's God, but that's, we can't prove that. The Israelites, even though they have the gift of faith, and they do believe, but their faith is weak many times. Their faith gets shallow because they're wanting to make sure, once they start suffering or things aren't going their way, they start doubting, and we do the same thing even now. That if things aren't going the right way or as fast as we want, we just say, well, I'm not going to pray anymore. Why bother? Or I'll go to church, but I'll go to church if. All right, so now we're moving on to Amalek attacks Israel and is defeated. So Amalek is the king of the Amalekites. To Joshua, Moses said to who? I stood at on Mount Nebo, top of that big high mountain in Jordan, overlooking the promised land, the land of Canaan. Moses dies, and according to Jewish tradition, he's actually assumed into heaven in the expeditions that the Israelites made regions. By the way, from that time period, we find out information that a lot of these places were sacked. They were sacked and destroyed, and who ends up being the people that live in this area? The Israelites. So there is external evidence that really does point to all of the stuff that we're reading here in the book of Joshua and leading up to it here in Exodus. Then came Amalek and fought with Israel at Rephidim. And Moses said to Joshua, choose for us men, later on down the road. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses told him, and fought with Amalek, and Moses, Aaron, the land of Egypt, that's gone, this is about a month or two, about 2 months in. And yeah, they're going to be encountering these different local people that are not going to be welcoming them. Just like, maybe when the Europeans first came to different areas here, they were attacked. Like the king of the Amalekites finds this as a threat. You can understand, by the way, why Amalek might find them as a threat. There's so many people, right? There's huge hordes of people. So Amalek begins to get his people together to fight, and then we have this scene where Moses and Aaron and Hur go up a mountain. This is a beautiful scene, by the way. It's very powerful. Hur, most likely, is the their moving church. So put that in the back of your mind. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, and when he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. So it's an ancient form of prayer to hold up your hands and pray. You'll see that in the ancient Roman catacombs of the earliest Christians, right? In the paintings, we see some of the earliest religious artwork in the catacombs, and one of them is this position of prayer, just like that. It's called the Orans position. That's why we're holding our hands in the ancient form of the Orans, and this is what Moses is doing. probably has a lot more armaments and chariots than they do. They're kind of coming out with their gold and, things from Egypt, but they really aren't, you know what I mean? They're not from slavery. But Moses, they're going to grow weary. But he's an old man, so of course they are, if he's holding them up all day. So Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and put it under him. But that was comfortable. And he sat upon it, and Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. So his hands were steady. So that means that he after a while had to sit down, he was sitting on a rock, and sundown, right? Pretty cool. And Joshua mowed down Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And recited, and he will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and called the name of it, "The Lord is my banner," saying, "A hand upon the banner of the Lord. The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." Amalek made war with the people of God. He ultimately is defeated. Who are these people? But because he warred against the people of God, ultimately he's defeated. And that his memory is blotted from the face of the earth. Like, who cares about Amalek today? Right? This is where we get the term, "The Lord is our banner," which is Yahweh Nisi. The Lord is our banner. So when you go into battle, the ancient thing would be to carry the banner of the empire or the kingdom that you're representing. So the banner that the Israelites have is the Lord himself. He is what marches before them in battle. Now stop and think about that for another second. When you think about politicians that go up against Rome, so perhaps Tiberius Caesar Tiberius, or one of those guys around there. But if you weren't a Roman historian, now back then that was everything. I mean, Caesar, that's huge. Like probably more powerful and well known than even the President of the United States. Right? An empire. So, and look what we're talking about today. We really don't care to talk about. Down the mighty from their thrones and has lifted up the lowly. So we can see this coming to play now in Israel's history coming out of Egypt, starting with Pharaoh himself, of course. Now we're going into chapter 18. This is where we encounter Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses. Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses, and for Israel. Moses' father-in-law had taken Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her away, and her two sons, of whom the name of one was Gershom, for he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." And the name of the other, Eleazar, for he said, "The God of my father was my help, and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh." So, for example, take a look at these names. So even Josh is my salvation, or Yahweh is salvation. So we see this, the meaning in names, or even in the change of names. So we see something kind of similar here, that the names even of Moses' children have these meanings. So Eleazar came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. Now, doesn't that make sense? Stop and think for a second. Where's the mountain of God at? Horeb, where there is Mount Sinai. So Mount Sinai is within the area of Horeb. And remember, 40 years prior to that, where was Moses living? There. So that's why they encounter Jethro. So they're back in this region. So they're back there, and so think of big mountains, and the highest, the very high mountain, Mount Sinai, is off in the distance. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. And when one told Moses, "Behold, your father-in-law Jethro," we have the Israelites, it says, are living in the wilderness. So it's flatter, it's not big mountains. And so Jethro finds Moses' wife and his two grandsons. Those are Moses' sons. And then Moses meets them, and he shows a lot of respect to his father. I don't always expect that, almost like, not quite worship, but almost like a big Mesopotamian thing, I should say. And it goes on to say, then Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come on them in the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. So just think, after Jethro, Moses left as a young man, and then ultimately made his way to Egypt, and then that whole time in Egypt, and now they're on their way back from Egypt. And Jethro